You're kneeling in cold stone silence. The air smells of damp wool and fear. Through a narrow window slit, you see torches moving up the mountain road. Closer now, closer than prayers can stop. Your fingers tighten around wooden rosary beads worn smooth by decades of devotion. Somewhere in the corridor behind you, a younger sister is weeping. You don't turn. You've already chosen what comes next. And in this moment, before the gates shatter and history closes its hand around your throat, you understand something terrible. Surviving might be worse than dying. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me that a story buried for centuries in Ottoman archives can reach someone like you tonight, wherever you are. This was the autumn of 1463, high in the mountain convents of Thessaly, where the borderlands between Christian Greece and the expanding Ottoman Empire had become a killing ground not just for soldiers, but for symbols. The convent of St. Theodora had stood for over 200 years, a fortress of faith perched on cliffs that seemed designed by God himself to resist invasion. But walls built for heaven don't hold against empires built for conquest. And when Mehmed II, the same Sultan who had torn down Constantinople's ancient defenses just a decade earlier, turned his gaze toward the last pockets of Christian resistance in Greece, he wasn't interested in negotiation. He wanted erasure. The nuns knew they were targets. Refugees fleeing other convents had brought stories so brutal that even the abbess, a woman who had buried plague victims with her own hands, went pale hearing them. Captured sisters weren't merely killed. They were transformed. Their identities, their vows, their very souls considered raw material for the empire's machinery of conversion and control. According to Venetian intelligence reports recovered from the archives in Dubrovnik, Ottoman commanders operating in the Greek highlands had explicit instructions. Christian clergy who refused to renounce their faith were to be processed as examples, a bureaucratic phrase that concealed unspeakable methods. 29 women lived in St. Theodora that autumn. The youngest was barely 16. The oldest had taken her vows before Mehmed was born. They came from villages scattered across the Pindus Mountains, daughters of farmers, widows seeking refuge, girls escaping arranged marriages. What united them wasn't background. It was the choice they'd made to live outside the world, to belong only to God. That choice was about to be tested in ways their liturgy had never prepared them for. The assault came at dawn, not with ladders or siege towers, but with something more efficient and terrifying. Cannons. The same bronze-cast artillery that had shattered the Theodosian walls of Constantinople now turned a convent gate into splinters and dust in less than 4 minutes. Janissaries poured through the gap like floodwater, their white caps and curved blades moving with disciplined precision. This wasn't rage. This was procedure. One survivor, a local girl who worked in the convent kitchens and managed to hide in a grain cellar, later testified before a papal investigator that the soldiers didn't shout or loot randomly. They moved room to room with a list identifying each nun by name before binding her wrists with rope that had clearly been cut and measured in advance. They had known exactly who was inside. Someone had told them. The abbess, Mother Eleni, tried to position herself between the soldiers and her youngest sisters. A janissary captain, his name recorded in Ottoman military logs as Hassan Bey of Adrianople, spoke to her in flawless Greek. He offered terms that sound almost reasonable in the archived translation. Renounce your Christian obstinacy. Accept the Sultan's faith. You will be given new positions, new lives, protections. Mother Eleni's response was recorded by 2 separate sources, one Ottoman and one Venetian with nearly identical wording. She said, "We are already dead. You're only deciding how we'll be remembered." That answer, delivered with the kind of calm that comes from absolute conviction, sealed what came next. By midday, the convent was burning. Not accidentally, strategically. The chapel, the dormitories, the library where centuries of hand-copied psalters had been preserved, all put to the torch. The message wasn't just military. It was theological. This ground, once consecrated, was being reconsecrated through fire and conquest. But the nuns themselves were not burned. They were far more valuable alive. 22 women, 7 had been killed during the initial assault, were chained together in a line and marched downhill toward the main Ottoman encampment near Larissa. The march took 3 days. They were given no food, only enough water to keep them conscious. When one collapsed, she wasn't helped. She was dragged. Turkish administrative records from the period, meticulous in their bureaucratic detail, list them not as prisoners of war but as ganimet, spoils, war booty. Their names were erased, replaced with numbers and brief descriptions. Female, religious order, Greek, aged approximately 25, resistant. The precision is chilling. These were not crimes of passion. They were processed atrocities, logged and filed like grain shipments, and the destination listed in the ledger? For transfer to the capital, disposition to be determined by the Imperial Council. The journey from Thessaly to Constantinople covered over 300 miles, most of it by forced march and the final leg by galley ship. They traveled alongside barrels of olive oil, bales of wool, and other captives, Serbian peasants, Albanian boys destined for janissary training, Greek scholars whose libraries had been ransacked. On the ship, according to a Genoese merchant who witnessed their boarding at the port of Volos, the nuns were kept below deck in a compartment normally reserved for livestock. The heat was suffocating, the stench unbearable. Yet every night, faintly, the merchant reported hearing singing. Hymns in Latin and Greek, voices cracked and dry, rising through the wooden planks like prayers from a floating tomb. When they arrived in Constantinople, renamed Istanbul but still haunted by its Christian ghosts, the sisters were paraded through the streets. This wasn't unusual. Public displays of captured clergy served a dual purpose. They demonstrated Ottoman dominance, and they tested the conquered. Would former Christians intervene? Would anyone dare? The answer consistently was no. Fear had already done its work. The nuns were marched past the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral converted into a mosque, its crosses torn down and minarets erected like exclamation points of conquest. One witness, a Venetian diplomat named Giacomo de Langucci, wrote in a coded letter to Rome. They walked as though already dead, eyes cast down, lips moving in silent prayer. The crowds parted. No one spoke. Even the children did not mock them. They were taken to Topkapi Palace, not to the grand halls where sultans received ambassadors, but beneath, into the service tunnels and storage chambers that snaked under the courtyards like a buried city. These spaces existed in official records, but not in memory. Ottoman architecture was designed with layers, the visible world of power above, and the invisible machinery of control below. The nuns were placed in a vaulted chamber originally built for storing grain. Stone walls, no windows, a single iron door. And here, the second phase began. It wasn't torture in the medieval sense. No racks or branding irons. It was something more insidious. Systematic degradation designed to break identity itself. First, their habits were removed and burned. They were given plain gray shifts, identical and anonymous. Their heads were shaved. Names were forbidden. They were referred to only by number. Then came isolation. Each woman was separated into a cell barely large enough to lie down. Food was delivered irregularly, sometimes twice a day, sometimes not for 2 days, disrupting their sense of time. Light came only from a torch in the corridor, flickering and uncertain. The goal was disorientation, a kind of spiritual vertigo that made it impossible to remember who you were before the walls closed in. But the Ottomans miscalculated. These women had lived under vows of silence, fasting, and enclosure for years. Deprivation was not new. It was familiar. And in that familiarity, they found resistance. Sister Magdalena, the youngest, began scratching marks on her cell wall with a pebble, counting days. Another, Sister Thekla, used the rhythm of the call to prayer, 5 times daily, as a clock to structure her own devotions. They couldn't see each other, couldn't speak, but they synchronized their prayers, whispering the same psalms at the same hours, creating a hidden liturgy that echoed through stone. After 30 days, the approach changed. Kindness arrived. An imam, elderly and soft-spoken, visited Magdalena's cell. He brought bread, cheese, clean water. He spoke gently about the oneness of God, the shared heritage of Abraham. He never threatened. He simply asked, "Why suffer? Your God wants your heart, not your pain. Speak the Shahada, and you'll walk in sunlight again." Magdalena, starving and exhausted, almost broke. She later admitted this in a letter smuggled out years afterward, that in that moment she wanted so badly to say yes, not because she believed it, but because her body was betraying her soul. She refused. So they stopped feeding her entirely. One by one, the sisters faced versions of this test. Some were offered positions in the palace, honored roles as tutors or weavers. Others were promised release, safe passage back to Christian lands. But every promise hinged on the same demand: renounce the cross. Two sisters, both from Corfu, eventually relented. They were taken away immediately, dressed in fine clothes and never seen again. Whether they lived in comfort or were quietly disposed of once their propaganda value expired, no record survives. Their disappearance, however, had the opposite effect. The remaining women hardened. Each refusal became a vow renewed. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Sister Thekla, while being moved between cells, noticed a collapsed section of wall in a forgotten corridor. Behind it, an old Byzantine cistern, long abandoned and dry. She told the others in whispers during the brief moments they were allowed to empty waste buckets. Over weeks, during the few seconds of contact they had, they coordinated. One by one, during the darkest hours of night when the guards were fewest, they slipped through the gap. In that hidden cistern, they built a chapel, not with wood or gold, but with desperation and ingenuity. Shards of broken pottery became candle holders, a torn piece of linen, an altar cloth. With charcoal from extinguished torches, they drew crosses on the walls, and there in absolute secrecy they gathered to pray. No hymns, those would echo. Only whispered words, shared memories of churches they'd known, scripture recited from memory, fragmentary and fierce. Ottoman records make no mention of this chapel. Why would they? It didn't exist in their world. But in 1962, during restoration work beneath Topkapi, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary: a small vaulted chamber covered in Christian inscriptions, crosses etched into stone, Latin phrases half erased by time, and one sentence, carved deep and deliberate: Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. Carbon dating and stylistic analysis placed the carvings in the late 15th century. For decades, historians debated their origin. Then a researcher cross-referenced Venetian intelligence reports with Ottoman administrative gaps, spaces in ledgers where entries should have been but weren't. The pieces aligned. The chapel was real, and it was theirs. How long they worshipped there, no one knows. Months, certainly. Perhaps more than a year. But eventually, a new sultan ascended. Bayezid II, more pragmatic than his father, but no less absolute. He ordered a purge of all unproductive captives. Efficiency over symbolism. A bureaucrat reviewing the ledgers noted a group of women consuming resources but producing nothing. No conversions, no labor, just resistance. The order was brief: dispose. There is no execution record, no burial site. The sisters simply vanish from history at this point, erased as cleanly as their names had been. But absence can be evidence. A Venetian courier, writing in 1485, mentioned rumors among palace servants, women who had refused the Sultan and been sealed in the lower chambers. Another account from an anonymous Greek source spoke of voices heard beneath the old palace foundations during winter nights, singing hymns in a language the new occupants didn't understand. Superstition? Perhaps. But in 2003, during seismic reinforcement work, engineers reported finding a sealed corridor beneath the grain stores. Inside, scattered bones. No identification possible after 5 centuries. But alongside them, something unmistakable. Fragments of cloth, remnants of what textile analysts confirmed were once religious habits. And carved into the wall above, barely visible, a single word in Greek: elpis. Hope. The Ottoman Empire lasted another 4 centuries, built on conquest, administration, and the absorption of 1,000 cultures. Its archives are masterpieces of bureaucratic control, recording everything from tax revenues to the names of horses. But in those archives, the nuns of St. Theodora exist only as gaps, spaces where ink should have flowed but didn't, silence shaped like guilt. Yet their story survived anyway. Not in official histories, but in whispers passed between servants, in the testimony of diplomats who saw things they weren't supposed to, in the physical evidence they left carved into stone where no one thought to look. They won not by escaping, but by refusing to disappear. Every scratch on a wall, every whispered prayer, every moment they chose suffering over surrender was an act of defiance the empire couldn't file away. Centuries later, their names are mostly lost. But their faith, stubborn, unbreakable, carved in darkness, remains. And if you listen closely to the stones beneath Topkapi, you might still hear it. Not a voice, exactly, but an echo. The sound of women who knew what they were choosing and chose it anyway. Who understood that some things matter more than survival, and who left behind a message that no conqueror, no matter how powerful, could ever fully erase. We were here. We believed. And you could not make us forget.